This chilling but true account centers on Mary, Queen of Scots. Facing execution for treason, she surprised onlookers. Despite her imminent death, she stayed composed, smiling as her servants broke down in tears. In telling this story, you'll explore not just her final act of courage, but the deeper meaning of dignity in death. Here's how you can break it down. Mary Stuart, known to history as Mary, Queen of Scots, was born into a world of power and peril. From the moment of her birth in 1542, she was a queen. Her father, James V of Scotland, died just 6 days after she was born, leaving the infant Mary as the sole heir to the Scottish throne. But being a female monarch in a world dominated by male rulers was dangerous, and Mary's life was shaped by a never-ending web of political alliances, betrayals, and shifting loyalties. At just 6 years old, Mary was sent to France to be raised at court and prepared for her future role as the Queen of France. She married the Dauphin, Francis, in 1558, and when he became King Francis II, she was briefly Queen Consort of France. But this reign was tragically short-lived. Francis died of illness in 1560, and the young widow, still only 18 years old, returned to a Scotland that was no longer the country she had left behind. Scotland had changed. The Protestant Reformation had swept through the land, and the Catholic Mary returned to a nation deeply suspicious of her faith and foreign upbringing. Despite her lineage and beauty, Mary's rule in Scotland was marked by turbulence and scandal. Her marriage to her cousin, Lord Darnley, was intended to solidify her claim to the English throne, a throne she believed rightfully hers due to her Tudor blood. But Darnley was vain, violent, and unstable. Their marriage rapidly deteriorated, and when he was found murdered under mysterious circumstances in 1567, suspicion fell on Mary and her close associate, the Earl of Bothwell. Within months, she married Bothwell, a man widely believed to have orchestrated Darnley's murder. The marriage scandalized the nobility and the people of Scotland, and Mary's once loyal supporters turned against her. She was imprisoned and forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James VI. Desperate and betrayed, she escaped captivity and fled south into England, seeking refuge with her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. But Elizabeth saw Mary not as a guest, but as a threat. Mary had a strong claim to the English crown, and many Catholic factions saw her as the rightful queen. Fearing rebellion, Elizabeth had her imprisoned for 19 long years in various castles and manors across England. During her captivity, Mary became the figurehead of numerous Catholic plots to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. Whether she actively participated or not, the mere association with these conspiracies, especially the infamous Babington plot, was enough to seal her fate. Elizabeth's advisors, particularly Sir Francis Walsingham, argued that as long as Mary lived, she would be a rallying point for insurrection. Eventually, even Elizabeth, who hesitated for years, was persuaded to sign her cousin's death warrant. As Mary awaited her execution in the cold stone walls of Fotheringhay Castle, she displayed a calm that baffled her captors. She was 44 years old and had spent nearly half her life in English captivity. Still, she maintained a regal composure, writing letters to allies in France and the Pope, arranging for her belongings to be distributed to her loyal servants, and preparing her soul for the end. She prayed constantly, her Catholic faith growing ever more fervent in her final days. She wore red beneath her black outer garments, red, the color of martyrdom in the Catholic tradition. It was a deliberate statement, a final act of defiance and identity. Mary was not just dying a political prisoner. She was dying as a Catholic martyr in a Protestant land, and she wanted the world to see it. Her execution was carefully choreographed, not only by the officials overseeing her death, but by Mary herself, who sought to control the narrative of her demise. Despite knowing that the end was near, Mary continued to comfort her servants. She spoke to them gently, reassured them that her soul would soon be free, and reminded them to stay strong in their faith. The woman who had once ruled 2 kingdoms was now preparing to die with the dignity of a queen and the serenity of a saint. As she walked toward the scaffold, she was not broken or bitter. She held her head high, determined to face her death not with fear, but with grace. On the morning of February 8th, 1587, the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle was cold and quiet, the stone walls heavy with the weight of history and death. Outside, the air was still. Inside, a small scaffold had been erected in the center of the hall, draped in black cloth. A low wooden block stood at its heart, along with a cushion for kneeling, a stool, and a gleaming axe placed deliberately where all could see it. The executioner, clad in black with a mask over his face, stood to the side, his silence more ominous than any spoken word. Shortly after dawn, Mary, Queen of Scots, was led into the room. She walked steadily, with measured grace, flanked by her ladies-in-waiting. Her face was calm, composed, and radiant with something far beyond resignation. She had prepared herself not just for death, but for spectacle. This was her final performance, and she intended to leave an impression that would echo far beyond the castle walls. She wore a long black gown, the color of mourning, but beneath it she had chosen a bold and deliberate symbol, a crimson underdress, symbolizing the Catholic blood of martyrdom. As she reached the scaffold, she turned to the crowd of gathered nobles and officials, over 300 witnesses, and bowed her head briefly. Her voice was clear and unwavering as she declared that she was dying a Catholic and an innocent woman. She did not plead for mercy. She did not weep. Instead, she forgave her enemies and prayed for Queen Elizabeth, the woman who had signed her death warrant. Her words rang with nobility and spiritual conviction, making it clear that she saw herself not as a fallen queen, but as a victim of religious persecution. She then sat on the stool provided and began to remove her outer garments. Her ladies, Jane Kennedy and Elizabeth Curl, helped her disrobe, revealing the brilliant red dress beneath. A gasp rippled through the room. This was not the dress of a defeated woman. It was the uniform of a martyr, the sign of someone who believed she was about to ascend into eternity, not fall into disgrace. Her ladies were trembling. Their hands shook as they helped her prepare. One wept openly, unable to contain herself. Mary turned to her and spoke softly, reassuring her. "Do not cry for me," she whispered, "but rather rejoice, for I am going to a better place." She gently wiped away the tears from their faces and kissed them. These were the final touches of a queen, not the gestures of pride or pageantry, but of compassion, of spiritual leadership. With her final moments drawing near, Mary knelt before the block, placed her hands together in prayer, and began to recite Latin psalms. Her voice was steady, even as her ladies wept behind her. She prayed aloud for the forgiveness of her sins, for the souls of her enemies, and for the triumph of her faith. When asked if she was ready, she replied clearly, "Yes," and laid her head on the block. There was a pause. The executioner raised his axe high above her neck, then brought it down with force. But the blow was not clean. The first strike failed to fully sever her head, and she cried out softly in pain. A second blow was required, and even then, the executioner had to use a third strike to finish the grim task. The brutality of the act stood in contrast to Mary's composed and peaceful demeanor. Her little dog, hiding under her skirts, emerged after her death, curled beside her lifeless body, whimpering in confusion. When her head was finally lifted for the crowd to see, the executioner made the customary cry, "God save the Queen." But instead of reverence, an eerie silence followed. Mary's red-dressed body, her lifeless face still bearing a trace of the serenity she had worn in life, left the witnesses haunted. Even the officials, hardened men accustomed to power, turned away with unease. Mary had faced her death not as a traitor, but as a queen and a woman of faith. Her strength in those final minutes, her composure, her smile, even as her servants wept and clutched their rosaries, left a lasting mark. In death, she claimed the dignity and control that had so often been denied to her in life. And in doing so, she transformed what should have been a moment of shame into one of legend. As the heavy wooden doors of the great hall creaked open, Mary's loyal servants followed closely behind her. Among them were Jane Kennedy and Elizabeth Curl, women who had stood by her through years of confinement, exile, and heartbreak. Their eyes were rimmed with red, and their hands trembled as they clutched rosaries and prayer books, barely able to walk without faltering. These women had not only served Mary, they had loved her, believed in her, and suffered with her. To them, she was not merely a queen. They saw her as a sacred soul, a woman touched by divine sorrow and undeserved suffering. And now, they were being asked to bear witness to her death. As Mary stepped onto the scaffold, her ladies were overcome with grief. Elizabeth Curl struggled to steady her breath, while Jane Kennedy turned her face to the floor, hoping to conceal her tears. Their sobs were soft at first, but as Mary began to speak her final words, asking for God's mercy and forgiveness, their restraint crumbled. The sound of their crying echoed off the stone walls, piercing the solemnity of the moment like a broken hymn. Mary turned toward them, not with irritation or fear, but with the tenderness of a mother comforting her children. She raised her hand and gestured gently for them to calm themselves. Her voice, despite everything, was soft and soothing. "Weep not, my friends," she said, "for today is not my end, but my beginning. I go to meet my Lord." It was not just a farewell. It was a command wrapped in compassion. She needed them to be strong, not for her, but for themselves. Their sorrow was a burden she did not want to carry with her into death. She was trying to lift them, even as her own life was about to be taken. Jane and Elizabeth fell to their knees beside the scaffold. They clasped their hands tightly in prayer, forcing their sobs into whispered supplications. Their queen had told them to be brave, and they would do their best to obey. But the sight of her standing before the executioner, radiant in red, composed beyond understanding, was almost too much to bear. One of the younger servants cried out suddenly, her voice sharp with anguish. A guard stepped forward, but Mary shook her head, signaling him to let her be. She did not want her final memory to include violence against those who had loved her. She turned to her ladies one final time. "Remember," she said, "we are not born for this world, but for the next." Then she gave them a look filled with profound peace, with gratitude, with love that transcended language. In that moment, something passed between them that could never be captured in ink or retold in full. The bond of shared suffering, of faith, of a long and terrible loyalty that was now being sealed in blood. As the execution began, Mary's ladies covered their faces. They could not watch, but they could not look away. When the first blow fell, and Mary cried out faintly in pain, a collective gasp rose from the witnesses. Jane Kennedy let out a cry that shook the room, raw, pure, and full of unbearable grief. She collapsed to the ground, clutching her chest as if it were her own neck beneath the axe. Elizabeth Curl tried to steady her, tears streaming silently down her cheeks, her lips still moving in prayer. After the final stroke, as the executioner held up the severed head, one of the ladies fainted. another vomited into her hands. And yet Mary's final expression, the trace of her calm smile still visible even in death, seemed to silence the chaos. Her serenity remained as a ghostly presence in the room. Even those who had condemned her felt its weight. Mary's ladies were not allowed to take her body immediately. Guard had ushered them away, some with force. But as they were led out, heads bowed and hands shaking, they carried something deeper than grief. They carried the image of a queen who had met death with unhackable grace, who had looked into their eyes with compassion, and who had smiled. Yes, smiled, even as the axe was being raised. Long after that day, the women who had attended her would speak of her death not with horror, but with reverence. They would say she died as a saint, as a true daughter of God. And that smile, offered not to comfort herself, but to comfort them, would remain imprinted on their hearts like the last light of a dying sun. A queen had died, but in her final moments she had lifted her servants above the sorrow of the world and invited them to glimpse something eternal. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, sent a tremor through the courts of Europe. News of her death traveled quickly, carried by letters, messengers, and whispered rumor. But it was not the manner of her sentencing that most shocked the world. It was the grace and courage with which she died. Her final moments became the stuff of legend, her poised composure and soft-spoken forgiveness echoing far beyond the cold stone of Fotheringhay Castle. In life, Mary had been viewed with suspicion, even scorn. But in death, she became something altogether different, a symbol of dignity, of conviction, and of tragic majesty. For many Catholics across Europe, Mary's death was immediately interpreted as martyrdom. She had died proclaiming her Catholic faith in a Protestant realm, and she had done so with unwavering clarity. The red dress she wore beneath her black gown, the color of blood, the color of sacrifice, was no accident. It was her final message to the world. In dying, she aligned herself with the centuries of saints and martyrs who had faced persecution and death for their beliefs. And unlike so many who begged for mercy or trembled at the edge of the unknown, Mary had smiled. She had reassured her servants. She had walked with calm toward the scaffold. These were not the actions of a traitor. They were the quiet victories of a woman who had already made peace with her fate. Artists and writers soon seized upon the drama of her final hours. Paintings depicted her disrobing before the crowd, the crimson dress glowing like fire beneath the black veil of sorrow. Poets wrote verses honoring her strength, her piety, her royal blood. Historians debated her guilt and innocence, but all seemed to agree on one point. Her death had been unforgettable. And perhaps more importantly, it had been victorious in its own way. She had lost her crown, her freedom, her throne. But in the end, she had claimed something more enduring. She had shaped how the world would remember her. Even in Protestant England, where her very name had once inspired fear, her death began to soften opinions. Queen Elizabeth herself was deeply troubled by what had been done. Though she had signed the execution order, Elizabeth reportedly wept bitterly when she learned that it had been carried out. Some say she blamed her advisors, claiming that she had not meant for the warrant to be enforced so quickly. Whether out of guilt, fear, or political calculation, Elizabeth's reaction revealed a truth. Mary's death was not just the end of a political prisoner, it was the end of a cousin, a fellow monarch, and a woman whose fate had been entwined with hers for decades. In Scotland, her son James VI, who had once been declared king while his mother languished in captivity, chose not to retaliate. He had grown up under Protestant tutors and English influence, and the memory of his mother had been painted for him in cautious, sometimes hostile tones. Yet even he could not ignore the power of her final act. As he grew into his role as king, and later as James I of England, he carried with him a complicated legacy, one shaped by the memory of a mother who had died with more courage than many had lived. Over the centuries, Mary's image continued to evolve. She became a romantic figure, a tragic heroine, the doomed queen whose beauty and intellect were no match for the brutal politics of her time. Playwrights like Friedrich Schiller dramatized her life, while poets like Robert Burns mourned her fate. Her story was retold again and again, not just as history, but as legend. And always at the heart of that legend was the moment of her death, the walk to the scaffold, the red dress, the prayers, the smile. It is that smile above all that remains. In a moment when fear and despair would have been understandable, Mary offered something else. She offered serenity, not just to her sobbing servants, but to everyone who would come to know her story. In doing so, she took control of her legacy. She could not stop the axe, she could not rewrite the charges against her, but she could choose how to meet the end, and in that choice she became more powerful than those who had condemned her. Mary, Queen of Scots, died without a crown, without a throne, and without a country. But she died with her soul intact. Her final moments were not filled with panic or bitterness, but with the grace of a queen who knew that history would one day remember the way she died. And it did. Her dignity, her compassion, and her courage transformed a political execution into a timeless testimony of human strength and spiritual faith. Even now, more than 400 years later, her story continues to haunt and inspire, because in her last breath, she taught the world how to die with honor.